There is a mystery in the depths of the sea that has not yet been spoken, and when it rises, the world will remember what it forgot. What if the greatest story ever told isn't in our history books, but buried beneath the waves? For the past 2 episodes, we laid the groundwork. We explored the 2 dominant narratives, the traditional religious view, which roots human history in divine creation and sacred texts, and the mainstream scientific perspective, which charts our progress through evolution, migration, and civilization. But something is missing. The stories we've been given feel incomplete, like pages have been ripped from the book of history. We've been given fragments, half-truths, and carefully curated lessons. But what if there's another story? A story that connects the pieces. A civilization that existed before recorded history. A civilization that wasn't just lost, but erased. This brings us to the 3rd narrative. For centuries, the legend of Atlantis has been dismissed as nothing more than a myth, an allegory meant to illustrate moral and philosophical lessons rather than an actual historical account. But what if the story we dismissed as myth was actually the mother of all civilizations? What if its kings were the first to shape humanity, guiding us out of darkness and into the age of knowledge? Welcome to the beginning of the 3rd narrative. To understand where the story begins, we need to return to Plato. Plato lived around 400 years before Christ and remains one of the most influential philosophers in Western history. But he also preserved one of the most controversial stories ever recorded, the story of Atlantis. And according to Plato, he did not invent it. In the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, the story is traced back to Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who lived roughly 2 centuries before Plato. Solon traveled to Egypt, where he met with the priests of the Temple of Sais. And there, the priests told him something that challenged the Greek understanding of history. They told him,
"Oh, Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you."
The point was not that Greeks lacked intelligence. It was that they lacked memory. The priest explains why.
"You remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones. You do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed, or remnant of them, which survived."
That line changes the frame. History is no longer a straight line. It is the cycle of rise, collapse, and forgetting. According to the priests, Egypt had been spared more than others because of the Nile. It didn't burn, and it didn't flood the way other lands did. So, the priests recorded what others forgot. And in those records, they preserved a story that Solon had never heard. A story about Athens, not as a young city-state he knew, but as an ancient power from 9,000 years earlier. An Athens that was just, wise, military disciplined, and divinely guided. This was the revelation, that Greek civilization was not a beginning, but a remnant. That its ancient glories were not legends, but memories. That it had once stood against an empire from across the Atlantic, Atlantis. According to the priests, there was a time, 9,000 years before Solon's visit, when the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks knew as Athena, chose a special land. A land with the perfect climate and conditions to produce the most virtuous and the most disciplined of humans. That land was ancient Athens. They were not mere citizens. They were disciples, a civilization designed with divine intent. They were humanity's high point. And then came the test. From beyond the Pillars of Hercules emerged a force unlike anything the world had ever seen: Atlantis. The Atlanteans, with their advanced knowledge and boundless ambition, had conquered islands, coastal Africa, and parts of Europe, and now they turned their sights on the Mediterranean. Their aim wasn't coexistence, it was domination. And the only force to rise against them was Athens. When the rest of the known world fell silent, when allies retreated and resistance crumbled, it was Athens alone that stood its ground. And what followed was the greatest war in human history. The ancient Athenians, vastly outnumbered, fought with unmatched courage. They repelled the Atlantean advance, liberated enslaved nations, and turned the tide of the invasion. But just as the war reached its climax, the earth itself turned against them. Without warning, the world shook. Earthquakes ripped through the cities. Torrents of water swallowed coasts. In a single night, the conflict was erased.
Violent earthquakes, floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared in the depths of the sea.
Neither victor nor vanquished remained, only the memory, preserved in Egypt. The priest warned Solon that much of what he would read had been altered, not in truth, but in language. The names had been translated into Egyptian and then retranslated into Greek. Like a mirror passed through fog, the image remained, but not without distortion. Still, Solon understood what he had been given, not just a story, but a responsibility to remember, to write, to pass it on, and so he did. He began to compose the story in verse. Although he never completed the work, his writings were passed to his descendants. His great-grandfather, Dropaitus, preserved them, and then Plato inherited them. And now, so have we. But this is just the beginning, because if Atlantis truly existed, then the past we've inherited is only half of the picture. What was Atlantis really? What power did they hold? And what echoes of that lost civilization still linger in our own? In Plato's Critias, the story begins in an age when the gods divided the world among themselves. Poseidon, lord of the sea, received a vast island beyond the Pillars of Hercules. There, he found a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her, Poseidon reshaped the land around her dwelling, creating alternating rings of earth and water, concentric circles, a central island enclosed by layers. At the center stood the sacred ground of Atlantis. From Poseidon and Cleito come 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins. Poseidon divided the island into 10 districts and placed one son over each region. But the eldest, Atlas, ruled the central kingdom and held authority over the others.
The eldest, who was the first king, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic.
The island and the ocean surrounding it would carry his name. This was not merely a city, it was a network. Plato describes Atlantis as a place of extraordinary abundance.
They had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings and potentates.
Forests provided timber. The mountains contained metals, including the mysterious orichalcum, a red gold substance said to shine more brightly than almost anything except gold. The land produced crops. Animals roamed freely. Hot and cold springs rose from the earth. Canals carried water through the city. Harbors connected Atlantis to the sea. Bridges linked the rings of land, while a grand canal opened the capital to ships arriving from distant regions. At the center stood the sacred citadel, and within it, the temple of Poseidon. The temple was lined with precious metals and dominated by a towering image of Poseidon riding a chariot drawn by winged horses. Atlantis was not only wealthy, it was engineered. Its beauty was organized. Its abundance was structured. And its sacred center was also its political center. But beneath the beauty was something else. Atlantis was built for power. Its regions were not loosely connected. They were coordinated. The island was divided into districts. The plain was divided into sections. Each region supplied resources. Each region contributed to defense. Each region served the larger system. Atlantis was not only prosperous, it was administratively precise, military prepared, capable of projecting power far beyond its shores. Its strength came from organization. Local structures fed the center. The center directed the whole. And at the heart of that system was a code. According to Plato, the laws of Atlantis were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum inside the temple of Poseidon. At appointed times, the 10 kings gathered to deliberate. But before judgment could begin, they performed a ritual. A bull was captured without weapons and brought to the sacred pillar. It was sacrificed over the inscription. Its blood was mixed into a ceremonial drink. The kings poured a portion into the fire, drank, and swore to uphold the laws of Poseidon. Only then could they judge disputes, reaffirm their unity, and govern the empire. This was not a democracy. It was a sacred hierarchy. Political authority, divine law, blood rituals, and kingship were bound together at the center of the system. For generations, Atlantis lived by these principles. They prospered, not by conquest, but by character. Justice, humility, and virtue defined them. They held wealth, but they weren't owned by it. They built temples and towers, not to boast, but to honor the gods. They knew restraint. They remembered that wisdom was the root of power, and in that restraint, they flourished. But the divine blood within them, generation by generation, thinned. The spark of Poseidon faded, and with it, their humility.
When the divine portion began to fade away, and the human nature got the upper hand, they then, being unable to bear their fortune, behaved unseemly.
Virtue gave way to vanity. Moderation surrendered to ambition. The Atlanteans, once paragons of balance, became drunk on their own dominance. To the outside world, Atlantis still shimmered like a star. But those who could see clearly knew the truth. The soul of the empire had decayed.
And to him who had an eye to see, they grew visibly debased, for they were losing the fairest of their precious gifts.
They no longer built temples for worship, but for pride. They no longer ruled with justice, but with fear. The divine blueprint had been rewritten by mortal ambition, and the gods took notice. Zeus, king of Olympus, convened the divine council. The verdict was swift. The Atlanteans had broken the sacred order. They had turned from their purpose, and now they would face the consequences. The earth cracked. The temple shook. Mountains groaned as if mourning. Fire erupted from the depths, while the sea surged with unnatural fury. Walls crumbled. Towers fell. Cities vanished beneath the waves. The empire that had once commanded continents was gone in a night. The roar of the ocean replaced the clamor of markets and the chants of rituals. Where there had been cities, only silence. Where there had been temples, only ruins. And the ocean, as if guarding a shameful secret, never gave it back. So what do we do with this story? Could Atlantis have been the Garden of Eden? At first glance, the resemblance is tempting. Both are remembered as places of abundance. Both are associated with divine order, flowing water, fertile land, a sacred center, a world that appeared almost perfect and is eventually lost. However, I do not think Atlantis was Eden. I think the connection is more interesting than that. What if Eden preserves the memory of something older? Not merely a garden, but a condition. A world in which the order was natural, immediate, and present. A golden age before humanity needed kings, laws, armies, and rituals to hold civilization together. And what if Atlantis emerged after that condition had already been lost? Not Eden itself, an attempt to rebuild Eden. A memory translated into architecture. A golden age reconstructed through concentric rings, sacred temples, districts, kingship, law, and ritual. That would explain why Atlantis appears so close to perfection, and yet remains vulnerable to corruption. Its order is no longer natural. It has to be maintained, administered, enforced. And once restraint disappears, the same structure that preserved harmony becomes a machine of domination. Now, remember what the Egyptian priests told Solon, that the story he would be hearing had been altered, not in content, but in language. In other words, it's the same play, just different costumes. This is the ancient version of the game Telephone, a truth passed down, retold, reinterpreted, until myth and history begin to blur. What if that happened here? What if the story of Atlantis didn't vanish? It just transformed and has been woven into the fabric of our religions, our myths, and our memory. That is where the first narrative, second narrative, and third narrative begin to overlap. In Genesis, from Cain to Noah, the world descends into corruption and is destroyed by a flood. In Plato's story, Atlantis descends into corruption and disappears beneath the sea. In Genesis, the sons of God intermarried with the daughters of men and created divine human lineages before the flood. In Plato's story, Atlantis is ruled by 10 sons born from the union of a god and a mortal woman. In both stories, an older world vanishes, and in both, only fragments survive. Different traditions, but perhaps not entirely different memories. And then there is Göbekli Tepe, which appeared near the end of the last ice age, shortly after the period in which Plato places the destruction of Atlantis. What's interesting is that the Bible says Noah landed his ark on Mount Ararat, located in modern-day Turkey, not too far from Göbekli Tepe. Is that a coincidence? What makes this significant is that animal bones have been found at Göbekli Tepe, suggesting that sacrificial rituals were practiced there. And in Genesis, what's the first thing Noah does after the flood?
And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar.
He sacrifices animals. Now, does that prove the builders of Göbekli Tepe were survivors of Atlantis? No. Does it prove the site was Noah's altar? We cannot know for sure, but it raises questions worth carrying forward. What if civilization did not simply begin after the catastrophe? What if some part of it survived? What if the sudden appearance of organized rituals, agriculture, and social order was not only an invention, but an inheritance? Knowledge carried forward after the collapse. Memory surviving the destruction of the world that created it. That is where the third narrative begins to take shape. Atlantis may not have been the beginning of civilization, It may not have been the origin of humanity, but it could have been the keystone. A civilization standing between worlds, one that inherited fragments of an older golden age, attempted to rebuild that order on Earth, and then collapsed beneath the weight of its own corruption. But if Atlantis fell, what happened to the people who escaped? What if there were not only one survivor, not only one ark, not only one destination? What if fragments of that lost world traveled outward, some east and some west? Not armies, not conquerors replacing entire populations, small groups, navigators, teachers, carriers of memory, people who preserved pieces of the old world through stories, symbols, rituals, bloodlines, and knowledge of the stars. That possibility would explain why flood traditions appear on both sides of the ocean, why ancient societies remember civilizing figures arriving after catastrophe, why so many cultures tell stories of outsiders who brought calendars, agriculture, law, architecture, and sacred knowledge, and then disappeared. Atlantis was not merely a lost city. It may have been a bridge between myth and memory, between the first narrative and the second, between a world that vanished and the civilization that rose from its ruins. Because the past is not always written in paragraphs. Sometimes it is encoded, preserved in myth, etched in stone, hidden in ritual, carried in blood. And if Atlantis left fragments behind, the next question is not simply whether the island existed. The real question is this: where did the survivors go? That is where we go next. We follow the trail west, across the Atlantic, into the Americas. I'll see you in the next episode.